At the time I make this video, the Sony PlayStation Portable is just over 20 years old. I'm making this video today to celebrate the console's release date here in the UK, like I did with my DS Nostalgia video a few months ago. So the console was actually released earlier than this in other countries, but that's just how it is here in Britain. Progress has always been slow for us. Anyway, like I always say in these nostalgia themed videos, this isn't a review per se, but more a fond look at the system, talking about its features, mixed with my own personal thoughts, feelings and memories. So if you're just looking for a straightforward review of the PSP and don't give a shit about my own personal memories associated with it, then please click away now. Thank you. A strange little memory I have of the PSP is something that happened years before the PSP even came out. I want to say around 1999 or 2000-ish. I used to have a friend called Hamish, who was quite well known for talking all kinds of nonsense about everything. He was one of those people that would quite confidently try and convince you that he was an expert in pretty much anything you were talking about. You know the type. Anyway, around this time he started telling me about something that he'd read about Sony and how they were developing a new handheld that would play games that were on the same level as PS1 games, and the games themselves would come on tiny little discs. Bear in mind that the current top handheld at the time was the Game Boy Color, which was an 8-bit system. I thought his claims were just nonsense, and the whole idea of having a portable system which used discs just seemed very silly to me. I mean, I knew how easy it was to scratch my PS1 discs, or how my big brother's portable CD player would skip if it was knocked about a bit. It just seemed a bit ridiculous to me that a handheld would use discs. So a few years later, in 2005, the PlayStation Portable came out and proved me very wrong. The first version to be released was the 1000 series, also known as the Fat model because it was kind of on the chunky side. I never had one of these as I was late to joining the PSP party. Having just got my Nintendo DS at the time for my birthday, it was unlikely that my mum would spring for a PSP for my Christmas on the same year. And the PSP was quite a bit more expensive than the DS, if I remember rightly. But I remember how I felt the first time I saw the PSP. I just got my DS and been blown away by the graphics of the Metroid Hunters demo and Mario 64 DS. Only to then see the PSP a few months later with its games like Liberty City Stories, looking more like a PS2 game on a handheld. It kinda dampened my enthusiasm for the DS. Like I said in my DS Nostalgia video, I often overlook the DS, and this is kind of the reason why I did back then. Basically, I was a little jealous of those who got a PSP instead of a DS, and kind of wished that I'd waited a few months to get a PSP instead. So I could have then been playing GTA in high school instead of Mario, which seemed a bit lame in comparison to my teenage brain at the time. So for several years I watched the PSP with great interest, while settling for my DS, and tried to be content with the much less sophisticated DS games that I had at the time. Incidentally, the PSP version of King Kong is actually not that bad. Why did I have to have the bloody DS version and all its craptastic glory? Life. Don't talk to me about life. But finally, at the end of Christmas 2007, I had enough Christmas money of my own to go to Argos and pick up a PSP for myself. By that time the Slim and Light 2000 model was on sale, and I picked up this nice looking silver one. The PSP follows a similar layout design to the Atari Lynx, Sega Game Gear and Game Boy Advance, in that it has the screen in the middle with the buttons to the side of the screen. Like the Game Boy Advance, it also has two shoulder buttons, left and right. As this is a PlayStation, it of course has the familiar circle, X, square and triangle buttons. And kinda new for a handheld at the time, this little directional nub, which to be frank, is kinda rubbish. On the box here you'll notice that the nub is a light grey colour, but mine has a white one. This is because my original started going bad quite quickly after I had bought it, and ever since it has had drift issues. I tried to replace it a few years ago with this white one, but it then turned out to be even worse because it doesn't work at all now. I did try and find my original one for this video, but it's lost somewhere in my cupboard of useless crap and I couldn't find it. So for this video I'll be mostly showing my other green PSP for gameplay, as my silver one from back in the day can't really be used to play games anymore because the directional knob doesn't work for a lot of games. On the right side of the unit is the power button, which can be used to switch off the power or put it into sleep mode. Sleep mode isn't so great with the PSP's kind of short battery life, but if you switch it off you have to wait for the system to boot up again, which could take a couple of seconds, kind of annoying if you're on the bus and just want to flip out a game. On the other side of the device is the memory card slot. Annoyingly, Sony was all about trying to force people to buy their own branded memory cards, and so the PSP uses their own memory sticks, which were always more expensive and harder to come by than a simple standard SD card. Or you could just do what I and a lot of other people did and just buy one of these micro SD card adapters to slot in there, giving you far more memory at a lower cost. On the top of the device there is a switch for turning on and off the wireless connection, and you'll notice that you get the left and right shoulder buttons, but not L2 or R2 like you would with a standard PlayStation controller. That can be somewhat annoying for using the PSP to play PS1 games, as you are missing a few buttons. In the middle there is a micro USB socket, which you can use to connect your PSP to your computer to install games, music and other things. You'll notice that there are two little holes on either side of it. This was to attach certain things to it, such as a camera, which I sadly don't have and cannot show you. Another thing of slight interest is on the bottom side. You get the standard headphone socket, but there is an additional socket beside it. You could actually buy a special cable to plug into this socket that would allow you to connect it to your TV through a component connection, though the picture on the TV is really small and not particularly good looking. It was a nice idea, but sadly could have been a bit better. On the back of the unit there is the removable battery cover, which makes replacing the rechargeable battery inside quick and easy. At least it would be if they still made these batteries. This easy access to the battery design would be a bit of a taboo for modern electronic designers, who hate consumers being able to get into their devices to replace parts and prolong their inevitable upgrades to the next model. But these were different times. And finally, of course, you have the UMD drive, which I think is kind of cool in its neat little design. The UMDs themselves are something of an interesting novelty. UMD stands for Universal Media Disc, and they are just tiny little discs, smaller than a GameCube disc. Though with the plastic casing around them they end up being about the same size. Evidently they had the same thought I had when my friend Hamish and I talked about the handheld using discs back in the day, and so they came up with this slightly strange idea of protecting the disc in a plastic shell. Still, it's kind of a fun novelty, and I kinda like them. When I got my PSP with my Christmas money at the end of 2007, I remember I just had enough money to get the console, but not enough to actually get any games for it. I had to wait until after Boxing Day when the shops reopened to go looking for games. In the meantime I just had the console and tried messing around with it to see what else I could do. The answer was not a lot, at least not initially. This was before we had our first computer with access to the internet, so we didn't have a broadband router that would have allowed me to connect my PSP to the interwebs. But a year later in 2008, we were finally in the digital age and I was able to connect my PSP up and toy around with some of the features on the PSP. Unlike the DS, the PSP could connect to the internet quite easily and was capable of doing other things which the DS didn't do, such as playing certain video clips, viewing pictures and playing MP3s. By going online with it you could also play other audio files as well, but initially it just plays MP3s. Back in the day I would sometimes carry my PSP around in my pocket while listening to music. A slightly odd thing to do perhaps, but I remember specifically putting on the Elder Scrolls Oblivion soundtrack on my PSP, and then with the volume low I would walk around the woods or the countryside on a beautiful sunny day with the Oblivion music to enhance the atmosphere. Just a silly little thing I used to like doing, but it really did enhance things with 16 times the detail. Speaking of music, one feature which I really enjoyed when I connected my PSP to the internet was discovering internet radio. I spent hours going through all the radio stations that I could find and enjoyed all sorts of weird and random things. I have a lot of nostalgia for this old PSP internet radio, and I really wish it could still work, but sadly the PSP doesn't connect to modern broadband routers, so you can't really use it anymore. I know some people like to find a little niche of musical tastes and like to stick with just that, but I've always had more of an eclectic taste in music, ranging from anything from classical to reggae to jazz to heavy metal. I like a lot of things. I remember discovering radio stations that played Hawaiian music and discovered that I actually quite liked that too. There was another one that played music from the 20s and 30s which was also kind of good. And you might think lesser of me for this, but I even found one station on my PSP radio that played Swiss and German yodeling music, which I kinda got into for a while. It just sounds fun, you know. Don't judge me. You're judging me, aren't you? Damn, I've said too much. The PSP also had a fairly decent, for the time, internet browser too. Unfortunately, obviously I can't show this to you in this video, with the PSP being incompatible with more modern broadband routers and Wi-Fi systems and all that. Of course, the main thing to do online with the PSP was to go to the PlayStation Store, where you could buy a whole load of games. They had a bunch of PSP games, as well as some PS1 classics. I remember buying all the PS1 Crash Bandicoot games, excluding Crash Bash, and it was something of a novelty at the time to be able to play these games on a portable system. They looked great on a tiny screen. This was a time before I had rebought all my old PS1 games, so it was nice to be able to play things like Crash and Rayman again on my PSP. I didn't buy a lot of PSP games from the PlayStation Store due to them being more expensive than buying an actual physical copy from the shop, and also due to how much space they took up on the memory stick. I remember buying Sid Meier's Pirates and Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories, but I don't recall buying any other PSP games from the PlayStation Store. I did have a bunch of demos downloaded from the store though, such as God of War. To date, this is my only experience with the God of War series. I really need to give them a proper go at some point. So yeah, the PSP is a games console first and foremost, so it makes sense now to talk a little bit about some of the games I had for it back in the day. The games I want to show to you now are not necessarily the best on the system, or even my favourites. For example, I would really like to talk to you about how great Vice City Stories is, but then that's a game I've only just recently got into, and did not have it back in the day. So for this nostalgic look back at the PSP, I'm going to just focus on a handful of the games that I personally had for it, back when the console was still current. So the first game I want to show is Test Drive Unlimited. This was the first game I got for the system, which I bought just after the Christmas holidays when the shops reopened. I remember playing it around New Year, and it being bitterly cold outside, and going to my local Blockbusters with my Christmas money and buying Batman the Animated Series on DVD, watching episodes of that in between goes of playing my shiny new PSP, and eating a tub of Celebration chocolates, back before they ruined them by putting Twixes in them. Why did they do that? Twix is a biscuit, not a chocolate, and not a very good biscuit either in my opinion. And while we're rambling about celebrations, I wish they'd bring back the truffles, they were great. But anyway, back to the game. This game was also on the PC and PS2. It was just a fun racing game with an open world that you could explore and drive around in like a maniac, crashing into oncoming traffic, while laughing like a psychopath, while listening to music and the police saying their annoying same few lines of conversation over and over again, unable to catch you. That's pretty much all I did in this game. I never got very far in it in terms of actual game progress, through the races and stuff. But you can, and with credits you earn from winning races, you can buy better cars and better houses. Test Drive Unlimited is a very fun open world racing game that did the whole open world racing thing before Forza Horizon came along and claimed it as their own invention. Having such a large open world on a system like the PSP does have its drawbacks, and the whole island just sort of feels a bit samey and kind of lifeless. I am kind of interested to experience the PC and PS2 versions to see if they feel a bit more alive. There are a few spots in the island which feel a little bit different, but most of it is just open, empty nothingness. Just grass and trees for the most part, with roads of course. It's still fun though in short goes, just driving around like a madman. But it's a great racing game too if you want to play it properly, like I don't. Worms Open Warfare, as you can probably guess, is a Worms game. I think this was the first one to go back to the traditional 2D style, after 3 slightly underwhelming 3D games. And the series has stuck with the same good old 2D style ever since. This came as something of a breath of fresh air at the time, seeing those classic 2D Worms again. Though I must say I didn't really play an awful lot of it. Worms is of course one of those games which is best played with friends, and well, I didn't have any friends with both a PSP and a copy of Worms Open Warfare at the time. In fact, unlike the DS, I never used my PSP for multiplayer games. It just wasn't as popular as the DS, I think. And so one of the major selling points of the Worms games, playing with friends, was completely lost to me with this PSP version. Anyway, I don't have much to say about this game. If you've played any Worms games, you know what this is. Worms. Worms never changes. In case you somehow don't know what a Worms game is, it's a classic cartoony strategy game where you take turns against either an AI player or a human player to try and kill all your opponent's worms. You do this by using all sorts of crazy weapons. Some are pretty standard and boring, like the bazooka and grenades. And then there are others which are really silly and fun, such as the holy hand grenade, super sheep, banana bomb, and occasionally a large donkey that falls from the sky and causes all sorts of devastation. What makes Worms even more fun is giving your worms silly names, naming them after friends, family, pop culture, characters, or even more abstract things, then watching them battle it out to see which worm is the best. You can also give them silly voices too, which also adds to the fun. I just really love the Worms series, at least the earlier ones. I think the series has kinda stagnated a bit in more recent years. I find the gameplay very addicting and really get into them. My favourite, like most Worms fans, will probably always be Armageddon. But this one is also a damn fine addition to the series as well. So much so that there was actually a second Open Warfare game on the DS and PSP, but I've not played that one myself. I know this might be a slightly lame choice to showcase considering that they're far greater and more memorable perhaps PSP exclusive games than this one, but please remember this video is about my own personal memories more than just simply showcasing the best of the best. Although having said that, I do consider LEGO Batman to be one of the best LEGO games that I've ever played at least. The PC and console versions are slightly better looking than the PSP version, obviously, but this is the one I had back in the day and I really enjoyed it. I mentioned when I was talking about Test Drive Unlimited that I bought Batman the Animated Series on DVD around about that same time, and that was really the beginning of my Batman obsession. I was already fond of Batman before that. Of course it's kind of hard to try and escape Batman growing up as a kid in the 90s and early 2000s, but until that point I was only really a casual fan, having only seen the first Tim Burton Batman, Batman Begins, and watching that old 60s cartoon on videotape. Anyone else remember that one? For the longest time that was my main exposure to Batman and my main version of Batman in my head. Also this one Ladybird book we had of Batman, in the Joker Funhouse kind of thing. Does anyone remember that one at all? Yeah, anyway. After getting into the 90s animated series on DVD, I was enjoying getting into the Batman universe and picked up this game for my PSP. Unlike the Star Wars and Indiana Jones LEGO games which came before it, this one did things a little differently, in that it had 3 completely original stories featuring many of the classic Batman villains, with a few less common ones thrown in there now and then too. I really like how they mix and match a lot of classic Batman stuff, with some of the characters being based on their appearances from the animated series, the Tim Burton movies, the 60s Adam West TV show, and some from the comic books. Yeah, apparently there's a comic of Batman too. Who knew? It was cool that you could play either as Batman and friends or as the villains with their own story. Then later you could play through all the stages again as these characters to unlock certain things which you couldn't do the first time round. Like most of these old LEGO games really. They all have a similar format. Another cool detail is that the overworld space for Batman is the Batcave, which makes sense, and it has some fun references and little secrets here and there. But on the villain side, you get to mess around in Arkham Asylum, where apparently they forgot to lock everyone up, and everyone just wanders around aimlessly all the time, sometimes getting into fights with each other. They are a colourful bunch too, and it's cool to see so many classic villains and Firefly all in one place. The game uses Danny Elfman's music from the Tim Burton movies. I'd like to showcase some of that here on YouTube, but you know, with YouTube and music being a bizarre load of bullshit, I won't. Which is why I'm using the music for this segment from the NES Batman game, for copyright reasons, which are bullshit. But I'm sure pretty much everyone is familiar with Elfman's Batman theme. I really like it, and it's cool that it's here. This game was popular enough to get 2 sequels, although by that time they started giving the characters voices, and in my opinion the LEGO game series just lost a little bit of its charm when that happened. I'm sure they are great games too, don't get me wrong, but I grew up with the LEGO Star Wars games where the story was told through comical mime and silly grunts or hand signals. I thought it was weird but charming in a fun kind of way, and so they sort of lost me a bit when they started talking. But I still enjoy going back to those older ones now and then, and this one really appeals to me, being such a big Batman fan. I just want to give a brief mention to Sid Meier's Pirates. The reason why it will be brief is because I got so into playing this game again, and I've actually went and wrote a full review of it, which will be on this channel soon after this video. I just got so into it and had such a blast playing it again. It's a remake of the old Pirates game which first came out in 1987 and then was remade in 1993. This version updates things once more for the PS2, PSP era of consoles, and it's pretty faithful to the older ones in many ways. It's a fantastic game, but anyway, I just wanted to briefly mention it here as it was one I had on my PSP back in the day and I have a lot of fondness for it. But a full review will be coming soon. I didn't buy many of the PSP games from the PlayStation Store back in the day, other than Pirates. I think the only other one I got was GTA Liberty City Stories. Annoyingly, my original game save was lost before I could make this video, and I couldn't be bothered replaying it all again for this video. Spent way too much time playing Pirates and Worms, you know. But I'll just muck about in the first island for footage for this segment, I guess. Which is kinda dull, I know, but what are you gonna do? If you've played any GTA, then you know what to expect here. You're a criminal scum doing missions for other criminal scum, working your way up and getting lots of money. This is the same version of Liberty City that was used in GTA 3, only it's set in 1998, so it has a few changes to the city here and there. Another kind of big change from GTA 3 is the inclusion of motorbikes, which is kinda cool I guess. For me, as well as a lot of other people I think, the big selling point here was the fact that it was a full 3D GTA game on a handheld. The novelty of playing a game like this on a portable was really cool, especially for 2005 when this first came out. I remember seeing images of this game in games magazines, and being a little bit jealous of PSP owners, as I unhappily played my Mario 64 DS on my Nintendo DS, which just a short time before had looked so impressive to me. In this one you play as Tony, surname that I can't pronounce, who is someone who gave you missions in GTA 3, and you get to find out his story and how he got to where he was in GTA 3. I must say it seemed like a bit of an odd choice when I first played it. I mean, who really gives a fuck about this Tony guy anyway, honestly? But you know what, it's not bad. Nothing about it really stands out as being particularly memorable here. It's all pretty much standard GTA stuff, but it does it all well and is quite fun. For me, I think the most memorable thing about this game is the intro song, which is really cool, and might possibly be my favourite of the GTA intro songs. I don't know, it just sounds cool. By the time I had access to the internet and could buy games off the PlayStation Store, I had a choice between either Liberty City Stories or Vice City Stories. I know some GTA fans are going to hate me for saying this, but I've always felt that Vice City was just a little bit overrated. Not that I don't like it or anything, just, you know. And the city in Vice City always felt a little bit too small in my opinion. I know technically it is bigger than Liberty City in GTA 3, but a lot of it is just lifeless beach, golf course, airport, and it really doesn't feel like that much of an interesting city compared to Liberty City. At least that's how I felt at the time. Perhaps I think differently now, I don't know. And so at that time I chose Liberty City Stories over Vice City Stories. I couldn't have both due to space limitations on my memory stick. But having just recently played Vice City Stories, I feel I may have made the wrong choice back in the day. Like I said, Liberty City Stories is a fun game, and it's the normal stuff you'd expect from a GTA game. But Vice City Stories has a much more likeable main character in the form of Victor Vance, a more interesting story, and also has something a little bit different in that you can take over businesses and play around with them a bit, which also makes for some new gameplay aspects like protecting them from rivals and just makes the world feel a bit more alive. Plus, Vice City Stories' version of V-Rock is amazing in my opinion, and probably my favourite radio station of any of the GTA games. It's just a great soundtrack in general from several of the radio stations, but in particular I do like V-Rock with its heavy metal. So, although in retrospect I think I probably should have gone for Vice City Stories over Liberty City Stories, it's still a great game, and it really was just the novelty of seeing a 3D GTA game on a handheld that made me really want to get a PSP in the first place, and experience it for myself. It might seem a bit weird and stupid to kids these days, but graphics like this in a handheld device was a big deal back then, at least I thought so. Before then I had GTA 2 on the Game Boy Color, at least for a little while. It wasn't very good, in fact it was awful. So awful in fact, I traded it with a friend for a copy of Donkey Kong Land, a far better game. Incidentally, I don't think we're friends anymore, I can't think why. Like all proper GTA games, Liberty City Stories is good to switch on and have fun just messing around, driving like a madman at high speeds, listening to the radio, running down some innocent peds. You gotta love it. The Tekken series has always been one that I've really enjoyed, ever since I first played a demo of Tekken 2 back in PS1. Tekken Dark Resurrection is based on Tekken 5, which was an arcade game which was ported to the PS2. Tekken 5 and Dark Resurrection are actually my favourite of the Tekken games. Before that it was Tekken 3. But this one feels like that game, only brought up a couple of levels. To a 5th level, some might say. I'm not really a fan of Tekken 4, didn't really like that one as much. And Tekken 6 feels pretty similar to 5, but I don't know, I just prefer this era of Tekkens. I played this quite a bit back in the day, and it's still fun to go back and have a few fights on it for a bit. Though every time I come back to it I'm rusty, so this gameplay will probably look like shit. I've never been very good at fighting games. But I do have a lot of fun with them, and especially with this one. The levels are interesting and some of them are quite fun and colourful. The music is fantastic too, and the game looks great on the little PSP screen. If you try and play this on a larger screen, say on a PC using an emulator, then it does look a bit rough, but it's not too bad on a smaller screen, as it was intended to be seen. It plays superbly, and just feels like a great Tekken game. As a Tekken game should feel. It would be a bit weird if it felt like Gran Turismo, now wouldn't it? Again, this is one which I'm guessing would have been a lot of fun to play with friends. But as I already mentioned, I didn't have any friends with a PSP back then, so I've never done that. It's still fun just to have a go on by yourself though, and I really enjoy it. I've never been able to fully grasp what the hell the story to any of the Tekken games are so far, so I can't tell you what the hell is going on here. But I guess it doesn't really matter, so long as it's a good fighting game, right? So those were a few of the games that I had back in the day, which I have a lot of fond memories of playing. I'm sure those of you who had a PSP back in the day will have others which you think are much more memorable, but as I said, these were just the games that I had. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about what it was like trying to find games for the PSP back in the day. So this here is my collection of physical copies of PSP media. It's not really a huge collection, is it? Especially when you compare it to my DS collection. Although the PSP was a much more capable console than the DS, it just wasn't as popular. By the time I got mine, it was only my local Blockbuster and Argos that had any PSP games for sale in my town, and even then, the selection was very small, whereas the DS had several shelves of games. Most of them shovelware crap admittedly, but still, it was a lot cheaper to get a DS and a lot easier to find games for it than it was for the PSP. At least in my experience. Perhaps in other parts of the world this was not the case, but in my neck of the woods the PSP just wasn't a heavy hitter like the DS was. Of course, having the PlayStation Store made up for the lack of a lot of physical copies of games, but then you had the issue of limited space, as I mentioned. And with Sony insisting on using their own memory sticks rather than standard SD cards, they could be quite expensive and still quite limiting on your potential to expand your game library. Since I'm showing off my collection here, you might have seen I've got a few here which aren't games. These are the VMD video discs, which again was kind of a cool idea, just giving you the option to watch movies and stuff on a little portable thing you could just fit in your pocket. But of course, with limited space, they usually came with no extra features and were more expensive than DVDs. Also, you're sort of lucky if you managed to get through a whole movie without the battery running out. But I bought these just for the novelty of it. In many ways I preferred the PSP over the DS, but I came late to the PSP, and by the time I did, it already felt like it was fading, and just unable to compete with the Nintendo DS. Because of that, I have a lot more nostalgia for the DS, and it can take me back to those times more clearly in my mind than the PSP can, which for me was always more of a solitary experience, having nobody else to play PSP games with, or even talk about. But then around 2010, 2011ish, just as the old DS and PSP were being replaced with newer systems, my interest in the PSP was revived, thanks to the magic of emulation. And this is one of the best reasons to own a PSP. In the early days of emulation on the PSP, there were some pretty weird things that had to be done, messing around with the battery and whatnot. Thankfully for me, by the time I got onto the emulation scene, things had been simplified a bit, and basically just requires you to install software to allow your system to be able to use the emulators. It's been a while since I set this all up, so I don't really recall what you have to do. I think all you need to do is get like the right BIOS or whatever to get things set up with the hacking software and whatnot. I don't know, look up a tutorial or something. I'm not an expert in these things and my memory is shit. But once you get it all set up, you can then just install all the emulators and ROMs that you want to your heart's content, or at least to the capacity of the card you've got installed. And you don't really need to worry about space as much now, because as I mentioned already, you can get one of these micro SD card adapters for a much larger capacity. It was so cool being able to play my old Mega Drive, SNES and Game Boy games on my PSP. I think there were a few options for emulation on the DS. My little brother had one of them R4 cards, I think, but I never really bothered doing anything with emulation on my DS. I mean, why would I when I had the PSP, which was a bit more powerful and had a larger screen. With all my music and retro games on my PSP, it became my portable console of choice. Not too heavy, easily slips into your pocket, and it looks kinda cool. Yeah, it was just great. Of course though, there were a few issues. SNES emulation could be a bit hit and miss, as it quite often is, for some reason. It could not run N64 very well at all, and although it does have built-in PS1 emulation, you have this slight issue that you're missing some of the buttons that the PS1 controller had, so some of the games are either unplayable or just a little bit more difficult to play as a result. Often they would map the L2 and R2 buttons to the nub, so you could sort of get around issues like that. but you've got no analog sticks, of course. So any PS1 game that requires analog sticks, not gonna happen. And I'm sorry to be so negative, but this little nub thing here, it really is just shit. What were they thinking when they made this thing? It feels bad, it doesn't double up as a button like the joysticks do on a PlayStation controller, and you only get one. It would have been sorta nice to have another one on the other side, being a bit more symmetrical, you know? And that would of course been good for like first person shooters or stuff like that. But the worst thing about it is that it seems to break quite easily. I didn't have my PSP very long before I started to notice my car drifting uncontrollably to the left on driving games. I did try and replace it at one point, as I mentioned earlier in the video, but it didn't work and I just made it worse, so well done me. Another slight negative thing I have to say about the PSP is that as far as being a good handheld back then, it was very impressive and far more capable than the DS, but I've got to tell you, my family were not too happy with me sitting quietly playing my PSP while they tried to watch TV or whatever. You see, while I could just plug in my headphones into my DS, which made pretty much no noise at all, the PSP on the other hand makes this really annoying sound while reading a VMD, which always sounded a bit like to me like someone sucking through a straw in a nearly empty glass. I remember getting complaints from my mum and my gran who couldn't stand the sound of the thing, so I'd have to play one of the games that was saved on the memory stick, which wouldn't make as much noise instead. So if you want to sit quietly and not draw attention to yourself while playing it, don't use the discs. Unfortunately for me, just as I was enjoying using my PSP as my go-to handheld of choice, even after my 3DS had come out, my good old silver PSP suffered a little bit of an accident. One day when I went to charge it, I couldn't find the charger that it came with, and instead found another one which had the same plug. This turned out to be a huge mistake. It turned out it was the wrong voltage or something, and it just fried the charger socket and made it impossible to charge my PSP. I did try buying one of those PSP battery chargers one time, but it was a piece of crap and would barely charge the battery. And of course every time I needed to charge it I had to take it out of the console, which was also a pain. Add to that the battery was starting to die. I could sort of charge it up using a USB cable and connecting it to my computer, but I always found that kind of slow and it was a bit annoying having to switch on the computer just to charge the PSP, you know. So eventually I just gave up on it and unhappily stored away my old PSP in my drawer of retired handhelds, never to be played again it seemed. It sat there for years and sometimes I would remember back to playing my PSP and wished that I could replay those games again. I tried emulation, but I've always had issues trying to get PSP emulators running smoothly, and it's just not the same on a big computer monitor. At one point I was determined to resurrect, a dark resurrection if you will, my old PSP and give it new life. In the years that had passed, the battery had actually expanded and made a bit of a horrible mess when it cracked out of its plastic shell. So I got a replacement battery, which as it turned out was a bit of a waste of money as it could barely hold a charge, and as it turned out was one that was designed for the original PSP and not the slim one that I had, so it never quite fit in properly. But it still sort of worked, it just meant I had to leave the back off of it. But the charge just wasn't there unfortunately. And I also had to use that cheap nasty battery charger instead of charging it directly into the system, because, as I said already, it got fucked, which severely limited my gameplay time. As I mentioned before, I did try and fix the nub stick thing by replacing it, but that didn't work. So all in all, I was having a lot of issues trying to bring my old PSP back to life. Since my attempts to bring it back to life had failed, in the end I decided just to give up completely and get an entirely new PSP. New in relative terms, I mean. In 2008, shortly after getting my PSP, the Slim and Light 2000 model, Sony then brought out the 3000 series. What was cool about the 3000s was that it came in various colours. I like having colour options for consoles. I get tired of the same old choices of black, white or silver, if we're lucky, which game console developers normally stick to. The 3000 was quite similar to the 2000, but had a much brighter and improved screen. They also added a little microphone there under the screen, presumably because the DS had one, but I've yet to find any game at all that's actually ever used it. I'm sure there's probably something out there, but I've never seen it being used. After that, they had the sliding PSP Go, which was kind of cool, I guess, though I would have thought it would have made more sense for it to slide in a way to protect the screen from scratching, or whatever. And then after that, there was the PSP Street, which is something I've never even heard of until making this video. Apparently it was just like a cheaper version of the PSP. And of course, after that, they released the PS Vita, the next generation of Sony handhelds, and to date, the last. Sadly, it didn't do too well. So when I was thinking about replacing my old PSP a few years ago, I had a lot of options. I forget now why I never went for a PS Vita, which seems to me like the most obvious choice, considering that it will be a lot more powerful and would allow me to expand into the PS Vita game library. But instead I decided to go for a 3000 model. I guess just because I was feeling a bit nostalgic and wanted something closer to the original that I had. Plus it could still play UMDs, which the Vita cannot. I didn't make it easy for myself though, because I decided I wanted one of the more unusually coloured variants, and decided that I was going to import one from Japan. Because all the cool stuff ends up as Japanese exclusives, doesn't it? Why can't we Westerners get a funky Spice Orange GameCube, or a Pearl White PS2, or a Pocket Station? Why do they get all the cool stuff? We just end up with a pile of bland looking black boxes. What's that about? I was torn between the light blue or the dark green. I think you can actually get a European one in the light blue colour, but I ended up going for the dark green one, just to be awkward I guess. Then later I felt like I should have gone for the blue one after all, but isn't that always the way? I can never make my mind up. Blue, green, whatever, I'm happy. They're both favourite colours of mine, and the important thing was that I had a working PSP again. After many years I could finally replay all my old favourite PSP games again, without the awkwardness of glitches and stuff from emulators, and even try out some that I'd never played before. I of course did all the hacking nonsense to get emulators working, and could enjoy screwing around with my lovely looking dark green PSP, playing Game Boy and Mega Drive and whatnot, but it was all very short-lived. For not long after getting my new PSP, I was watching a video by my good friend Kevin of Down the Rabbit Hole, where he was talking about his Retroid. In the video he showed a screenshot of the Retroid playing The Simpsons Hit and Run, and I was quite surprised by this. I asked him about this and he confirmed that the Retroid could indeed emulate some PS2 and GameCube games. Well, I was very impressed with this, and I loved the idea of playing all my old favourite PS2 and GameCube games on a little handheld that could fit in your pocket. So I went and got myself this purple, or indigo as they call it, Retroid Flip. For a time this thing was brilliant. I could have all my music and movies on it, get internet radio, which wasn't as fun as the PSP's internet radio, but it did hit that nostalgic nerve for me a little. And most importantly, I filled it with a shitload of games. From C64 to Game Boy Advance, SNES, Mega Drive, N64, PS1, PS2, GameCube, even some Wii, and of course some good old PSP games. It was fantastic. And notice how I say it was. Yeah, the thing you have to know about the Retroid is that they're not Sony or Nintendo, so the quality is not exactly the best of standards. As soon as I'd got the thing out the box, I had to do some fiddling around with it to get it set up. Not a good sign when you have to unscrew the back of your console to get it working right. At first, with a little fiddling around in the settings, I could play most PS2, GameCube and PSP games either perfectly or to a tolerable degree. But I noticed as time went on, it seemed to struggle a bit, to the point that playing Vice City Stories on it wasn't much fun because it kept stuttering slightly at random times, making me crash my car. After that, the hinge broke. Same thing happened to my DS Lite actually, except it happened to my DS Lite after about 10 or 15 years. Not a single year, like my Retroid. I guess I should have known better, as it's always an issue with flip devices, and perhaps I should have just got one of the other Retroids instead. I just like the idea of a flip handheld because it protects the screen, unlike the PSP, which always gave me slight anxiety putting it in my pocket, for fear of scratching the screen. Then just recently in the past few weeks, when I went to play on my Retroid, I noticed that the bottom had cracked. I unscrewed it and discovered that the battery had expanded. The battery had expanded to my original PSP a few years ago, as I mentioned already, but then that was about 15 years old at that point, not 1 or 2 years old, like this Retroid I have. It did still work and kept a charge for a while, however. It just felt a little scary using it, thinking that the battery could burst at any moment. But now, in the past few days when I tried to switch it on, it just refuses to switch on at all, and also refuses to charge. So after just 2 years of use, my Retroid is just a fucking paperweight. Brilliant. Anyway, sorry to have taken up so much time talking about my Retroid, when this video was supposed to be about the PSP. But my point is that this Retroid was brilliant for the first year or so that I had it, but in terms of longevity, it's a pile of shit. Whereas my lovely little PSP here is still going strong after almost 20 years. It still looks good, still plays good, and still gives me much joy. I know it's probably not fair to compare the Retroid to the PSP, considering that the PSP was made with far better quality standards, but I'm just a little pissed off with my Retroid, you know. I will not be buying a new one anytime soon, that's for sure. And so, once again, my PSP has become my handheld of choice. It can't play PS2, GameCube or N64 games, and it can't connect to modern broadband for internet radio. But it's still fantastic as a Game Boy Advance emulator, or Mega Drive or PS1, or you know, actual PSP games, with no stuttering or annoying glitches. I do want to get a more powerful handheld to replace my PSP at some point. I think I'll try out one of Retroid's competitors next time though, or I might even just get a PS Vita if it's not too hard to put emulators on. And before anyone suggests anything like it, I do not want to get a Steam Deck or anything like that, for the same reason I never really liked using my Switch as a portable system. It's just too big and cumbersome for my liking. I want something that will fit nicely into my pocket and not make my wrists hurt after 20 minutes. And I don't want a stupid smartphone, stupid bland slab of touchscreen nonsense. I need buttons! Buttons, man! I like buttons. Have I mentioned that before already in a previous video? You gotta have buttons, bro. I don't do the whole touch controls thing. If I can avoid it, I will. As I said already, the PSP doesn't have as much nostalgia for me as the DS does, but I do still have a good few happy memories from using it. More so from music rather than games, oddly enough, and with its capabilities for emulation, it's actually had a longer lifespan for me personally as my main handheld than the DS ever did. I know that battery won't last forever, and it will be a sad day when it finally goes, but it's outlived my Retroid by many years, and is currently serving me quite nicely. So those have been my thoughts, opinions and memories of the PSP, a fantastic handheld, and with the exception of the Game Boy Advance, which I biasedly love for nostalgia reasons, I have to say, I think the PSP is probably my favourite handheld of all time. Well, after the Game Boy Advance, as I say, but you can play Game Boy Advance on the PSP, so in that regards, it's probably my favourite. I'd love to hear any thoughts or memories you might have in regards to the PSP. So long as you're civil and respectful, I'd love to hear them in the comments section if you feel so inclined to share. But for now, I'm off to play some Sid Meier's Pirates on my PSP. Thanks for watching and adios.